Welcome to Satisfaction Factor, the podcast where we explore how ditching diet culture makes our whole lives more satisfying. Hey everyone, welcome back to Satisfaction Factor. I'm Naomi Katz, an intuitive eating, body image, and self-trust coach providing anti-diet support to free-thinking grown-ups who want to reclaim their autonomy and consent from diet culture.
And I'm Sadie Simpson. I'm a group fitness instructor and intuitive eating counselor, and I help other fitness professionals disengage from diet culture so they can improve their program enrollment, engagement, and impact and retention without shame and manipulation.
Awesome. Hey, Sadie.
Hey, Naomi.
We figured that today would be a good day for you to get to know us a little bit. If you're interested in hearing about how Sadie and I got to know each other and how this podcast came to be, I would highly recommend that you go check out our brief little intro episode where we sort of lay all that stuff out. But today we figured you don't know us, we don't know you, and so we are hoping that you all will spend some time with us going forward and that you might like to know something about the people you'll be spending some time with. So that's what we're doing today.
Yes. And it'll be kind of fun too because there's a lot we don't know about each other. So we will get to know a lot about each other throughout this conversation today, and it'll be fun to have our listeners join us for this experience.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to dig in, and yeah, you're totally right. It'll be fun to learn more about each other too.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to know is, what is your first memory of dieting or feeling like your body needed to change?
Oh, indeed. Right on the first question.
Right on the first one.
I actually skipped kindergarten. I was a year younger than everyone in my grade. I think for the most part wasn't a big deal, but around 5th grade, I would say, I sort of started to notice that the kids in my class were starting to lose their quote-unquote baby fat. It's a really stigmatizing term, and maybe we can do a whole other conversation about that another time. But, that they were becoming a little less soft and caring about stuff like clothes and all of that. And I still had all my little kid softness, and it definitely made me feel like something was wrong with me, even though, obviously the age difference totally was the reason for that. And of course, there's a lot in there about the fact that I would think that softness was bad in the first place. Obviously, that's something that's learned anyway, but I didn't know any of that in 5th grade. All I knew was my body was different and therefore wrong. Interestingly, though, then when I did finally hit puberty and I started to develop, I'd get interested in clothes and stuff like that, I actually encountered a fair amount of harassment from other girls about things like if I wore shorts or if I wore a form-fitting shirt, and I would get called things like a slut. Though by the time I hit high school, I basically had learned that there was just no right way for my body to be. Yep. And I think that that's an experience that maybe the details are different for a lot of people, but I think a lot of people have similar experiences about how they learn what is okay and not okay for their body.
Yeah.
What about you, Sadie? What's your
Oh my gosh. Thinking back on it, it was probably around 3rd grade when I noticed that my body was chubbier than my cousins and sisters. I hated PE when all my friends and the people around me, they were playing sports and they were doing all these other things. And although my parents signed me up for things like cheerleading and basketball, I hated it. I never was really into it. I was never athletic as a child, and still really am not as an adult either. But I noticed it was about 3rd grade that I was bigger than my cousins and my friends, and grew up as a very picky eater too. I was a very selective kid. And once middle school rolled around, kind of like your story, when bodies started to develop and started to change, kind of grew out of that chubby kid phase and started to develop more of a womanly figure or whatever, I still maintain this very picky, selective eating thing. I don't really know how to describe it. Like, I was just very selective on what I ate for as long as I can remember, up until about high school. And once, I don't know if this is what it was like at your school, but once I hit high school, all of these options opened up. Like, you could eat pizza every day. You had all these different selections of food in the cafeteria.
Totally. Pizza in the cafeteria was like the best.
Yeah, and I had friends who could drive, so we were going out to eat, and like my palate for eating, I guess, sort of expanded a little bit. And I started recognizing, like, oh crap, there's foods out here that I haven't eaten my whole life. Like, grew up basically eating chicken nuggets for like every single meal. My palate expanded, and when that happened, some of that, you know, whenever you go through puberty and the baby fat, in quotes, goes away, I started gaining some weight in high school. And that's when I really started to become aware of the idea of dieting and manipulating your body weight through eating and exercise. Ironically enough, as a result, which what I thought at the time anyway, as a result of like my expanding palette of foods that I was choosing to eat. So
yeah, that's so interesting. And it's funny, it's so interesting because I also was very unathletic when I was growing up. I can remember my parents signing me up for soccer because all of my friends played soccer, and I was like, I should play soccer too. And like within minutes, I knew I hated it.
Yes.
And it just was something that I learned to connect to until I was fully an adult, honestly, like athleticism or exercise or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether not having that connection to movement maybe makes it easier to disconnect from your body or something. I don't know. I'm totally speculating and theorizing at this point, but you know, something that's interesting.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Like, even like whenever we played basketball as a kid, my dad was the coach of my team, and it's, when I think about it, a lot of the times the coaches, like in the recreation league that I was in, the coaches, their kids were like the stars of the team. But my dad, this is actually kind of sweet. Like, he coached because he wanted to be involved. He wasn't coaching to grow the next basketball star of Lincoln, North Carolina. But it was just kind of ironic and funny, I thought. Even at the time, I always thought this was kind of funny, that my dad was the coach. I was like, please don't put me in. I just want to sit here and watch. And he, you know, for the most part, I think there were like rules that every kid had to play so many minutes per quarter or whatever, and I probably played that minimum amount I was supposed to play. But
so yeah, I definitely can relate to the expanding and like, you know, cafeteria wonderland experience. For me, I think that was something that started in like middle school. By the time I hit high school, I think the choices were all like, it still technically was a cafeteria wonderland, but I had gotten to the point where I was very, very self-conscious about my food choices and my body and stuff like that. And so I did not eat things in the school cafeteria by the time I got to high school. One of the big things that I think shifted for me once I got into high school is to put it briefly, I developed an eating disorder. I got real careful about controlling my weight and controlling my food intake. I generally feel like when talking about stuff like that that's in the past, it's really not helpful to talk about behaviors, so I don't need to go into that, but I was very critical of my body and had a real messed up relationship with food. And so the cafeteria in high school was not a fun place, but a really fraught place. I feel like I kind of went in the exact opposite direction of you, where like you got to high school and like had this like expanded palette of foods that I got into high school and was like, how can I restrict my palette of foods, essentially?
Yeah, well, that's interesting too, because early high school, 9th or 10th grade, you know, that's when the expansion of palate occurred. But then by about 11th grade was when some similar things started happening. I started bringing my own lunch, for example, of very specific foods that I thought that I needed to eat in order to change my body size and shape. That really sort of segues into like my first experience with dieting and following a specific plan. I'm just going to say it, Weight Watchers. Because yeah, because at the time that's what my mom was doing, and so she's doing Weight Watchers. I'm starting to notice that I'm gaining weight, and I'm like, well, crap, I need to do Weight Watchers too. And I think it was 11th grade was the first time that I ever like officially went on a diet. Well, I never like went to meetings or whatever, but I used like the resources that my mom had. And that's really like the first memory I have of officially dieting, and that, snowballs into a lot more over the years, but we can get into that later.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think Weight Watchers is one of those things that's like the entry point for so many people. It's weird. I never dieted. I just went straight to developing an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. But I was definitely surrounded by people who were dieting. Like I think my parents probably around that time were doing Weight Watchers, which again, not to like say anything bad about that, and it certainly wasn't why I developed an eating disorder. Like that's not even close to what I'm saying.
Yes, same here.
But just that I was very aware of Weight Watchers as a concept, even at that young of an age. And yeah, that it's just so interesting how that specific diet is such a gateway for so many people.
It is. And it's funny that you say that too, because I've had this conversation with a lot of other people close to our age, people who were in the millennial generation that we've grown up seeing the generation above us. Weight Watchers, it was just the thing that everybody did, and it's wild.
Yeah, like it's more unusual to not have an experience with Weight Watchers than it is to have one.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. So what about after high school? Sort of how did your feelings about your body and food and all of that sort of progress over the years?
Throughout the rest of high school, I would say that I was very concerned with maintaining or losing weight. So always trying to do something to, either to remain the size that I was, if I was at what I perceived to be a small enough size. And then I can remember too, like getting into my senior year, all these things come up, prom, and I don't know what your traditions were like, but our end of senior year traditions was everybody went to Myrtle Beach. So, having to wear a bathing suit and being around other teenagers your age.
I was in New Jersey. We went to Wildwood.
Yep. So being very conscious, very body conscious, and by that point, like I had started exercising, like taking fitness classes and going to the gym in preparation for big end of high school events like prom and grad week. That was a big thing, very big thing for me at the end of my senior year. And even going into college, I joined the marching band in college, and it was a very like strenuous, physically active thing to do from August to October or November of my freshman year. And I can remember we had practice, I believe it was at like 4:00 in the afternoon or something like that. Hottest part of the day in North Carolina.
Seriously, in August and September.
Yeah. But we would have practice at 4, and I remember I would get out of whatever, like my last class was at 2:30 or 3. I was like, oh crap, I need to go work out before going to be outside in the heat for like 3 hours. So I would get out of my class, I would go change clothes, I would go to the fitness center for like, I don't know, 30 or 45 minutes and do cardio, do the elliptical or treadmill or ride the bike or something, and then immediately go to marching band and be outside moving and sweating for like 3 hours. And looking back on that, I'm like, what was I thinking? But at the time, I was very fixated on the idea that I needed to go work out, a formal workout, I guess, that wasn't just going to marching band.
I was just going to ask that, whether like any of it was this concept that like marching band didn't quote unquote count as exercise because it wasn't like in a gym and like, with a calorie counter or a timer or something like that. Was that part of it?
For sure. Like that did not count in my mind. Like I had to go to the gym and and do, whatever the routine was at the time. I had to do that because it counted.
Interesting.
Yeah. What about you? Like after or during high school or kind of after high school, how did things evolve for you?
So I will answer that, but first I just have to go on this little tangent here because I think it's like it just came to my mind and I'm just curious about your thoughts on it.
Yeah.
So I didn't diet. I also didn't exercise. Like I kind of went straight to eating disorder instead, like to control my body instead of trying to do like, not that dieting and exercise can't be disordered, but like I didn't even attempt to exercise or anything like that. It like didn't even like there was some part of me that was like, oh, cool kids don't exercise or something like that. And I really, really think that some of that is like the cultural representations of people who were in very small bodies in like the 90s in that time frame. Like if you think about like Friends, or I guess it's a little later, but Gilmore Girls, like basically like all of these people who were in very much like smaller body sizes, but you never, ever, ever saw them doing any kind of physical activity. If anything, they would be like disparaging of physical activity. And again, I'm not saying that physical activity, that exercise is a technique for managing or changing our body sizes. Like, we know that's not true. Like, we know that movement is much more than that. And we know that there isn't a safe, effective, long-term way to change body size. So, like, that's not what I'm suggesting. But I do think it's interesting that despite the levels to which I was, like, obsessed with controlling my body size, exercising is not something that I ever considered doing.
Oh, that is super interesting. I think for me, the exercise component, like when I started making a point to exercise was like later on in high school, like towards the end of high school. And at the time I was also dieting pretty extremely. And I guess I probably had correlated weight loss that I saw happened as a result of a combination of dieting and exercise, but to the point of where if I didn't maintain this very low amount of calories consumed and this very high amount of exercise I was doing, like it's not something that could have ever been sustained at all, short term or long term. When I found exercise that I could actually tolerate and do on a regular basis, which again was at the time, like was just getting on the elliptical or the treadmill or something like that. Like it was so new to me since I grew up like not being like an athletic kid or really a desire to do any sort of athletic type thing. I don't know. It was almost an awakening, I guess, too, for me of like, oh, exercise. This is this thing I can do in an attempt to control my body weight. And, for a very, very, very brief period of time, it may have worked, but definitely not a healthy introduction to intentional exercise, I think.
I'm curious, did you have anyone like in your life who was an intentional exerciser, or who did you have any role models? So for instance, like I talked about sort of how my view on exercise, I think probably came from, to some extent, the people around me in my life, but also pop culture or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you have any recollection or any understanding of where you got the sense of exercise as a means for control of your body?
Growing up, my mom would go do aerobics and go walk and stuff on and off. Like, it was just kind of a casual thing, like from what I observed as a kid. And then as I was older, it was probably in like middle or high school, like my dad started running and biking and doing stuff like that. And it wasn't until like that didn't happen when I was a little kid that I can remember. But it was kind of weird. We joined the YMCA in my town when I was 15. It just opened, and my family joined. All of my other extended family, so all of my cousins joined, and it was just like this big thing that happened in our town that everybody I knew did and went to, and that's when I started exercising. It almost started out as like a social thing. We're like, okay, well, y'all are going to the YMCA this afternoon. We're going to go to this kickboxing class, or we're going to go run around the track or something like that. Like it initially started out as just kind of an activity or a thing to do, and just coincidentally, I think that kind of meshed with a time in my life when I was starting to recognize things like dieting and intentional weight loss. Like, I think it was just kind of a coincidental thing that all of that sort of happened around the same time.
Yeah. But you had, like, intentional exercisers in your life.
Kinda.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of, like, sort of. But again,
like,
it wasn't until I was older.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, but that's what I mean. Like, sort
Yeah.
of, like, at some point, like, by the time you started to use exercise as, like, this means of controlling your body, like, you had intentional exercisers in your life. Yeah, and so that's interesting because I really didn't. I had a lot of dieters in my life, but almost no intentional exercisers. So, like, that's interesting to see how that sort of played out for each of us in terms of what we use to control.
Yes.
So anyway, thanks for going on that tangent with me. Yeah, so my experiences with food in my body in high school, I'm going to honestly say, like, beyond, like, an overall sense of it being, like, really disconnected and disordered, I don't have, like, a super clear memory of a lot of that stuff, which makes a lot of sense considering how disconnected I was from it. When I went to college, I started, like, really struggling pretty seriously with, like, anxiety and panic attacks, which was really great in terms of complicating my relationship with food and my body, because it made it really hard for me to do even, like, simple things like go to the dining hall or, like, eat in my dorm room when my roommate was there, which was relatively often. We didn't live in a particularly, like, thriving college town, so, like we were just in the dorm room a lot, and so it made it really hard for me to eat on a regular schedule. And it's interesting, especially knowing what I know now about intuitive eating and, like, the binge restrict cycle, because what would happen is then I found myself eating large quantities a lot more often and started gaining weight, which, with all of my already issues with my body, caused me a lot of mental distress and definitely, like, didn't help the panic and the anxiety and all of that stuff. So yeah, it was a complicated time. Let's just say that. I actually eventually ended up leaving college. Like, I didn't graduate college. I left college because I just couldn't make it work with all the stuff I had going on.
Yeah.
I left college, I got a job, and interestingly, that around that time was when I would say that, like, my behaviors lessened to the point where I wouldn't call it an eating disorder anymore, but I would call it disordered eating.
Yeah.
Which we know, like, it's all on the same spectrum, but definitely less severe. But I would say, like, my late teens, early 20s was definitely, it was different. It was a different version of a disordered relationship with my body. I think that part of that is that it was a time where I just felt like, I think a lot of people feel really lost during that time in their lives. And I know I definitely did.
Yes.
And as a result, I think I attached a lot of my value to my physical attractiveness. And, like, as a result, I was in, like, terrible relationships and, like, that were not good for my mental health or my growth. Like, I, made stupid decisions and definitely, like, continued to have that pretty messed up relationship with my body. I think a lot of that started to heal and turn around when I eventually got diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and bipolar disorder, which, I got on medication. I, like, moved away. I moved out of my home state. I left New Jersey. Not that my home state was the problem ever, like, my family is wonderful, like, all of that. But I was just in a rut, like, with some not great behaviors and not great people and all of that stuff. And so I actually moved to Boston with one of my best friends, and it really sort of allowed me to break a lot of the little patterns and start building new ones. So
oh my gosh.
That was definitely where things started to get better once I, like, broke out of that and, like, shook things up for myself a little bit.
Yeah, you have to have, like, that turning point. And sometimes it is, like, a physical move, a restart, or something to kind of just break free from that. That is so. See, we're learning all kinds of new things about each other today.
For sure.
That's cool. I think the turning point, well, I don't want to say the turning point, but like a big benchmark point for me, I was probably, I don't even know, like maybe mid to late 20s. Like I had graduated college, got married, was working, and still kind of maintaining the idea that I had to do a lot of things in order to maintain a certain body weight. Like again, like I had to diet, I had to exercise, I had to do all these things. And up until that point, and I feel like this is a common theme among a lot of women, but up until that point, like cardio was my primary source of physical activity. Because, well, and you kind of said it earlier, like you can physically see on the treadmill or on the bike how many calories you're burning. And at that time, I needed to see some physical proof that I was burning calories. But there was kind of a turning point. I can't even exactly remember what happened, but I came to this realization that there is no way I could go on doing cardio like all day, every day, like multiple hours a day, multiple days a week. I was like, this is awful. I'm not seeing any changes in my body. I'm tired. I don't feel good. I'm crabby. I'm mean. And I was like, what do I do about this? And I came across this book, The New Rules of Lifting for Women. And I think the cover, it even
I
said,
am very familiar with this one.
it was like, lift like a man, look like a goddess or something like that. And I was like,
oh my God. Can we pause for a second and, think, and reflect on how gross that marketing is?
It was, man, at the time I was like,
I know,
this is for me. And I read it, I was like, well, at least if I can't be super skinny from doing all this cardio, I'm going to lift weights and I'm going to get super buff. And at the time, that was what my thought process was like. But looking back on it, even though it was like super skeezy and still like pretty doggone disordered, that was kind of a big turning point in getting away from doing lots of cardio and learning how to lift weights. Not to sound super cliche, like that was a big game changer for me, and like shifting behaviors and beliefs around like eating and exercise.
Yeah, I super duper relate to that. So, like, you know, I'm living in Boston, I'm living my new life. I'm definitely still not, I would not say I had like a healthy relationship with food at that point. I was definitely still, for sure, dieting. But, like, I guess at this point, in the way that, like, mainstream diet culture would call healthy, which again, we know is still not, but, you know, at the time, I felt really good about it, and I got a lot of praise for it, which felt super good, of course. But I also started exercising. At that point, I joined a gym. I would go on my lunch hour or like after work or something. Again, something that I got so much praise for.
Oh yeah,
which I loved. I couldn't get enough of that. But yeah, I started out just doing cardio partly because I didn't know. Like, I didn't know, I exercise wasn't my thing. I didn't know what the heck else I was supposed to do. So I was like, oh, cool, here's an elliptical. And I would just get on that elliptical machine and, like, look out the window into Government Center in downtown Boston and just, like, elliptical my way through, like, an hour or so. And I would be, like, so zoomed in on the calorie count. And, like, I definitely had it in my head that I had, like, certain levels that I had to hit for it to be worth it. If that meant if I had less time, that meant I had to go faster, or I had to like hike up again. I had to tick those boxes. Super healthy, obviously. Again, behavior that I was totally getting praised for. Interestingly, you know, of course, this is reflective of what so many people we know go through. I was dieting, I was exercising, and I was slowly and steadily gaining weight. But because I was getting so much praise for how quote unquote healthy and quote unquote good I was, like I wasn't as thrown off by it. It was very much the like good fatty narrative that like is so harmful, and I wish I could recall who came up with that phrase. I want to credit Aubrey Gordon for it, but I have no idea if that's actually true. But it was very much like that. It was like it was okay for me to be gaining weight as long as I was doing these behaviors that were good. And yeah, and then I discovered Pilates and was like, oh, resistance training, this is nice. And to be fair, I actually did really, truly enjoy the experience of doing Pilates. Although I will say that at that time, which we're talking late 2010s, early 20-teens, the community, and I know that it has gotten better, although it's still not great, was not. It was pretty toxic.
Oh.
In terms of like bodies and the way we talked about and represented bodies in that community. But I really enjoyed it. I actually ended up getting certified as a Pilates instructor. There was some part of me for sure that felt like I'm good, and it almost was like being a Pilates instructor offset the changes that I was seeing in my body, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And then I honestly have no idea why I was Googling this or why I got interested in this. But at some point I started developing this desire to like lift weights and build more strength. Honestly, it's possible that I had met my now husband by that time and he lifted weights and I just thought it was cool. I really have no idea. But I Googled essentially like women lifting weights or something, and I came across Jen Sinkler and her Lift Weights Faster program. And it was like the first time I'd seen like a woman who looked strong and wasn't talking about weight loss or diets or anything like that. And it really, really stuck with me. And she talked a lot about how strength carried like outside of the gym, which really resonated with me in a lot of ways. And, I started doing the workouts and I loved how they made me feel, I was like, oh yeah, strength does carry outside of the...
Yes.
And so from there, I started going through some of her other programs for like powerlifting and muscle building. And I went to a very similar place. And let me just be clear that this is not aligned with like how Jen markets her stuff like then, or, how her messaging now, like, so what I took away from this is not at all what she was saying. I want to be really clear about that. But I went to the same place that you did, where it was like, oh, here's this other measure by which to judge myself. Where like I had to be the strongest, or like the most, like I had to look strong and I had to feel strong and I had to lift as much weight as possible, and like I had to make people feel my bicep for some reason. Like that wasn't awkward at all. So yeah, I definitely went to the same place where at some point I like replaced the external feedback of cardio with the like external drive of strength training, even though I was getting the information from a place that totally didn't market it that way.
Right. Yep. Interestingly enough, that is kind of how I first fell into intuitive eating. So I did a Google search on how not to diet anymore or something. It was pretty close to that. It was like, what can you do to not be on a diet? And I'm assume it was probably more along the lines of like how to lose weight without dieting. It was probably the Google search that I did.
That sounds pretty spot on.
Yep. And I found intuitive eating. Like the Amazon link popped up and I clicked on it and I started reading some of the reviews. I was like, this sounds awesome. I need to do this. And I ordered the book, and I have a very similar experience of reading this book, and the content was very much dieting doesn't work. Trying to intentionally lose weight through diet and exercise, like that is not a long-term sustainable thing. And we have lots of studies to prove that this is not a thing. But the first time that I read it, in my mind, I was like, oh, I'm going to turn this into a diet. And I think
Of course.
Yeah. I think that's a common thing that a lot of people do when they're first introduced to intuitive eating. And I was definitely one of those people. When I was first introduced to it, and the first couple of times I read it, it was very much okay, I'm going to use this as a mechanism still to try to control my weight, although that is not what the intention of this framework is designed to do. And it was funny, like over, I don't know, I mean, it was an evolution of many years of like rereading the book and kind of researching more about intuitive eating online and following people on social media and stuff, that it finally like clicked for me that, oh, this isn't a diet, that this is something else. But I think it's neat to hear kind of your evolution and your introduction, I guess, to weightlifting and how that's changed over the years and stuff too. I think that can, like, a lot of that could be said for intuitive eating too. You're introduced to a thing and you make it into what your mind wants it to be, but over time that thing can change.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. Like, so true. Yeah, I mean, it's like you have to be ready for it to click. So it's funny, I don't teach Pilates anymore, and honestly, I didn't do it for very long, but there are some lessons from like the instructor training that still stay with me and that I still use as examples for like other concepts today. And one of them was that when we were doing the training, they always taught us you can say the same cue over and over and over again to the same person, and it'll just like go in one ear out the other, just like won't click. And then one day they'll come up to you at the end of class and be like, oh my God, that cue you used, it was so amazing. And it just, for whatever reason, they were ready to hear it and incorporate it into their own bodies. And it just like, and it was like they had heard it for the first time. And I feel like that applies to so many concepts that like, if we're not ready to fully understand it and hear it, that like, it's just going to go in one ear and out the other, or we're going to make it something else or whatever.
Yeah. So how did you get introduced to intuitive eating?
So it was sort of a roundabout thing. So I was, really getting into weightlifting. I was still teaching Pilates, and I started getting really into the concept of like food as fuel. And it was good at the time. I think that there's a lot, love your body for what it can do, not how it looks, like food is fuel, stuff like that. I think that those types of phrases are very, very reductive and definitely require us to widen our lens and learn more. And I think they're really, really, really helpful concepts as we're trying to transition out of diet culture and into something else. They're like that on-ramp to like body positivity or like body acceptance or something like that. So I got really into that concept and really started down this path of, health and wellness, like quotes around all of these words. And clean eating was the big one. So like I went way down the paleo rabbit hole, like, a lot of that. I definitely, I started doing things like making my own toothpaste and like stuff like that. I will say that to this day, I am still really, really picky about my cosmetic products and like the chemicals that are in them. And that's partly because of the work that I do on the side and like as a paralegal, but that's like a whole different conversation. But the clean eating concept really, really got in my head, and the health as like this like thing to pursue essentially. And so I actually, at this point I had a Pilates certification, I had a personal trainer certification, and I went ahead and got a nutrition certification too, a nutrition coaching certification, which very much reinforced these concepts of health and wellness and clean eating and all of that stuff. And so basically that was like the first incarnation of Happy Shapes coaching, was like online health coaching and like nutrition coaching. I definitely, even at that point, because of what I had learned through lifting weights and all of that stuff, like I definitely had it in my head that my coaching was not going to be based on diets, and it was not going to be based on body weight. Like I feel like I remember concept of Happy Shapes initially being like health coaching without the scale or something like that. But I was still very much promoting like a hierarchy of foods. And I was very clear that no matter what I said about body weight, my clients were coming to me and expecting to lose weight. So like it was a thing. So I ended up like, I think at some point in this era, like I at least got some concept of health at every size, although I unfortunately have no idea where I learned about it or how I learned about it or anything. But so I was starting to kind of learn about that, and I just was sick of like always feeling like no matter what I said and no matter how I framed it, I was like leading people down the path to weight loss. And I was starting to get really uncomfortable even with the concept of health coaching when it was so based in like food hierarchies and stuff like that. So I actually stopped doing any of that kind of coaching and just started doing like body image and self-trust. Like I was like, okay, we're going to work on the mindset. And I started an Instagram, and somehow through Instagram, I came across the concept of, for one thing, I started to learn a lot more about health at every size and like what it was really about, and like fully got on board with that. And I started to learn, like, again, I have no idea where I learned about it from, but the concept of intuitive eating ended up on my radar. And as I started to look into it, I was like, oh my God, this pulls together all the things. This is like, this is health at every size. This is body image. This is self-trust. So for me, because I had sort of gotten through this like very indirect, like twisty, windy road to get to intuitive eating, when I got to intuitive eating, I was already very clear that it was like not weight loss and not a diet. And I was like very ready for it to be that. But it was only because I went about getting to it in such a roundabout way.
Well, it's funny, like once I kind of had the epiphany, I guess, and got clear on what intuitive eating was, at the time I was doing some in-person personal training. And anytime I would get a new personal training client, I would immediately go on Amazon and order intuitive eating. I was like, you need to read this book. Because it was like the training, you know, it was more of the fitness side of things in the gym. Like I was helping people with it. I always just kind of give them that book as a gift. And even though in the book, like obviously intuitive eating is like a health at every size based framework, I didn't really grasp the full complexity of what health at every size was and what it means. As I was ordering a copy of Intuitive Eating for one of my personal training clients, you know, on Amazon, they suggest other things to order. Body Respect by Lindo Bacon was on there as like a suggested book. And I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. I'm going to get it. And I ordered that for myself and read that. And that's when things really like started to click for me in terms of what health at every size is and just what it means for us, you know, in not only like in the fitness industry, but like on the societal and the systemic level. And that was a pretty big turning point for me too, was reading that book, because it was very eye-opening for me.
That book is like, I don't even have words for how that book can like blow your mind, especially when you're ready for it, like we talked about, right? And especially when you're ready to take it in for what it is, and when it's sort of an entry point, it's like pretty mind-blowing. I weirdly didn't read that book until I was like pretty on board with health at every size already, and so I read it, and it was more like confirmation of everything that I had learned up to that point. But I can imagine reading it as like an entry point, and like, yeah, it would just be mind-blowing.
Yeah, and we can add that to the show notes too if anybody's interested.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, maybe you've sort of answered this, but how do you feel like your knowledge and your relationship to like health at every size, intuitive eating, body positivity or body acceptance, how do you feel like your relationship to that stuff has sort of changed over the years?
I mean, it's a constant evolution for me, like of really getting a deeper understanding of what all of these concepts are, again, on like a societal level, and just how they are all kind of intertwined, especially the body positivity side of things initially started out with like following people on social media, love your body, body positivity, blah, 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 blah. Like, you know, we all follow these influencers and these people that are very pro body positivity, but it wasn't until probably 3 or 4 years ago where I really started understanding like where the origins of the body positivity movement came from, and really started learning more about like body acceptance and body liberation and that side of thing versus just like the fluffy and cute Instagram body positivity memes, things like that.
Like the like in white ladies contorting their bodies to
show
like
squeezing
stomach rolls and being like, love this.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And I think, I mean, you've mentioned this too, like sometimes it probably is an entry point for a lot of people, but at the same time, like it's important for us to constantly like question, okay, well, where did this come from? Like where did this start? And I think that's really important for consumers of media to know, to get out there and to really understand where, like, for example, the body positivity movement, like how that began and that type of thing. But I mean, that was my process anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, I think that's very, very reflective of my process too. You know, I think the biggest thing that has changed for me over the years is that, like, just like you, my initial experience of all this stuff were, you know, straight size white women on social media and, you know, this very mainstream, like, body positivity and without any acknowledgement of the roots of the body positivity movement and things like that. And like, it was really all about how we feel about ourselves and less about how the system influences our feelings about ourselves and about others and all of that stuff. But the deeper I dove and like the more I started learning from fat women, black women, trans folks, queer folks, disabled folks, like marginalized communities, that it became very clear to me that this is more of an issue of systemic oppression and therefore social justice and community care than it is just about how we feel about ourselves.
Yes.
Basically, my relationship to all of this has just gotten, I guess you could call it more radical as I've widened my lens, you know, like where it starts to become more about white supremacy and capitalism and like these very high level systems of oppression, as opposed to just like, how do you feel about your body today? Not that that's not important, it's just not the whole picture.
Right. Yep. And I think, you know, there's a lot of people who have experienced this sort of evolution, or maybe, you know, if you're listening to this, maybe you haven't, I don't know, but I think to be open, like to learning more about the lived experiences of people and to really acknowledge that everybody has a story and everybody comes from a different place. And again, like on a societal level, there are so many systems that feed into this diet culture, like all these peripheral things that are happening like in our world as we know it right now. And it's important for people to, especially people who are talking about things like eating and dieting and wellness and health and things like that. It's something that we have to take into consideration, but we're so often consumed on everything on an individual level that we neglect to look at the bigger picture and the societal level of things. And I think that's been a big part of this growth and learning for me too.
Especially for folks like us who have a lot of body privilege, you know,
yes.
as, you know, straight size, or in my case, small fat, white, cisgender, able-bodied women, we have a lot of privilege. And so it's super, super important for us to be constantly learning from people who don't hold those same privileges.
Yes, for sure.
It's funny, like I say that it's radicalized me in some ways. And like my husband, who is like on my mailing list because he likes to read my emails, which I think is adorable, will occasionally like read my emails and be like, so you just went full on Marxist in this one. And I was like, yes, thank you.
Nice.
This is probably a good time to like sort of name some of people and the things that have been really influential for us, and we can add them to the show notes in case other people are looking to expand their lens too.
That sounds good. And I feel like I've said this word a million times, but it's been an evolution. Initially, like you, I started following people like Jen Sinkler and Girls Gone Strong to learn more about lifting weights and that side of things. But more recently, I really tried to expand the people that I follow to include people that don't necessarily look like me. Because a lot of these other people who I've followed in the past, they look very much like I do. And oh gosh, the first one that comes to mind is Aubrey Gordon from Your Fat Friend on Instagram. Maintenance Phase Podcast. I am obsessed with everything Aubrey Gordon does.
Oh my God, me too.
That has been a huge influence on me, really, in the past couple of years. But yeah, now that Maintenance Phase Podcast is a thing, it's changed my life.
I totally agree. Aubrey Gordon's been a huge influence on my views in this as well.
Yeah, I mean, some others, obviously, like we have our authors of intuitive eating that have been very influential.
And Health at Every Size.
Yeah, and Health at Every Size. Gosh, I'm trying to think of other people that I follow. I need to just pull up my Instagram account.
I can tell you that, like, while I unfortunately can't recall everyone I've learned from over the years, I can say that Sonia Renee Taylor has been, like, mind-blowingly huge in my evolution on this. Lindy West, Virgie Tovar, Reagan Chastain, Lindley Ashline, right? Chrissy King, who I can remember following all the way back in the Girls Gone Strong days.
Oh, yeah. Chrissy King, I've been following her for a very long time. A lot of the stuff that she has put out there has been very, like, I don't want to sound corny, but, like, life-changing for me, like, to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, my God, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I remember meeting Chrissy King at, like, a business seminar, basically, a few years back, and being like, oh my God, I'm meeting Chrissy King. So yeah.
No way!
And then one of the biggest, like most influential things for me has been reading Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings. My understanding of things and my framework for addressing these issues, and like even how I work with my clients, like literally like everything changed after reading that book.
Yeah.
So,
oh man, I haven't read that yet, but that was kind of similar for me. For Your Body Is Not an Apology. Mm-hmm. That was a big one for me. So yeah, well, again, we can link all these things in the show notes if y'all are interested in learning about other resources.
So we've got like a million influences here, right? Yes. So because, so our theme for this podcast, obviously, is all about noticing how widening our lens, like ditching diet culture, learning about intuitive eating and embracing the anti-diet lens, like how that has impacted our lives in non-food ways, right? Like, and how that impacts people's lives in non-food ways. So what kind of changes would you say you've noticed in the non-food parts of your life since going down this path?
It might be easier to ask what the opposite question is. It
hasn't changed for you.
One thing I am super grateful for is that I found this idea, this concept of intuitive eating before I got pregnant. Going through pregnancy and postpartum and having this knowledge learned from following the intuitive eating framework to not fall into this whole idea of having to get your body back after having a baby. That was a big freaking deal for me, to have that time in my life to be more relaxed around food and more flexible with exercise and things like that, when a time when so many people are like hyper focused on what a healthy pregnancy and a healthy postpartum is supposed to look like, because there's so much other crap going on. The last thing I needed to do was focus on, trying to maintain this certain appearance or whatever. Other than that, probably pretty much every other aspect of my life has been affected, I believe, from learning more anyway about this anti-diet framework and viewing life from the lens of a non-dieter. But the big things is just being more flexible instead of rigid in pretty much everything, in how I interact with my child or my husband or the other people around me, and learning how to establish boundaries and being okay with saying no is a big thing that has shifted over the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, getting a better grasp on what my personal values are and how I want to show up in the world. And that at one point evolved into like quitting a job that I actually, I liked my job, but it did not allow me to have the time to spend with my child and with my family. And really on that note too, like getting a lot more intentional, like with how I spend my time, who I spend my time with, what I give energy to, what I don't give energy to. It's kind of wild how this idea like of a non-diet framework, like intuitive eating, can kind of open the doors for a lot of other things in literally every aspect of your life. And I know that sounds like kind of like sentimental and cheesy, but it really does. So yeah,
it's totally true. I'm like nodding so hard that like I feel like I'm making myself seasick. Yeah. It's so interesting because I like my notes about this. I basically put 3 categories of things together, and they're all the things that you said. It's like
yes,
confidence. I don't feel like I have to hide or shrink myself or my opinions anymore, which, by the way, for an Enneagram 9 is like a big deal. Not trying to like quiet and censor your opinions, and like finding your voice is like a big thing for an Enneagram 9. So thank you, anti-diet culture, for that.
yes.
Boundaries. That's something that I'm definitely still working on, but learning to say no to things, like honor my own needs for space and rest. That's been a big shift for me. And then relationships, where like I recently realized that I kind of only have friendships now that feel substantive. I think I spent a lot of my life with relationships that felt like lopsided, or maybe like I had to be someone else, or that just in whatever way didn't feel good. And I really don't have any of those anymore. And I think a lot of that comes down to trusting myself, setting boundaries, and not hiding my true self from people. Like being confident enough to be like, we don't have to be friends if you don't like me.
And it is okay.
Right. Like I don't actually need you to validate me by being friends with me if I don't like you. Yep. Things like that. And so, yeah, a lot of that stuff has shifted for me, for sure.
From your experience, what's been the most challenging part of adopting an intuitive eating or an anti-dieting lens?
Absolutely, the number one thing is dealing with medical providers. Despite all of my privilege, I have still had to have some really difficult and very uncomfortable conversations with medical providers, and it is not fun. It's also a huge reminder of why this work is important, though. So, like, in some ways, I'm grateful for the fact that I've had those challenges, because it's a great reminder of why we do this work, but it's terrible. It's an all-around terrible experience, and it only is worse for people who don't hold the privileges that I do.
Oh,
so, yeah, that I would say that's the number one most challenging thing for me. How about you?
I think for me is being in the fitness industry, so working in an industry that is diet culture. This is what the fitness industry is. It sells weight loss. It sells body size. It sells all these, assumed norms of what we're supposed to look like and how we're supposed to exercise and how we're supposed to be in the world. And being a fitness instructor is challenging during these times, because not only are my peers, like other instructors, other personal trainers, still very much bought into the narrative that health and fitness has to look one specific way, but a lot of times, like, people who are coming to classes are still talking about, I need to burn this many calories, I need to get this many steps in, I need to lose this many pounds because my sister is getting married next month, and that sort of thing. So finding a good balance of having to take all of that in, like what's going on like around in the industry, and also using that as fuel to shake shit up in the fitness industry. It's a weird balance, but it is a challenge because it's the fitness industry.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. say no more.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that's. I'm sure that's very, very difficult. Like ended up leaving the fitness industry altogether. And, some of it is because I made that decision when I was still pretty early in my own journey with this stuff. And so, it just felt easier to, remove myself from it altogether, because it's important to recognize that, no matter how much you do this work and no matter how, grounded you are in it, being exposed to diet culture messaging, even as an intuitive eating and anti-diet professional, has an impact on our mental health and on our own sense of our bodies and our worth and all of that stuff. And so, for me, I was still early in my journey and didn't have that real solid footing yet. And so I just removed myself from it altogether. But even now, it can throw you a little and requires some practicing of resilience instead of it doesn't just bounce off you like rubber. So yeah, I'm sure that's challenging.
Yeah. What do you think is the most rewarding thing?
I mean, obviously this is going to be the most cheesy answer, but it's still totally true. But helping other people. Obviously, I definitely mean my clients and the folks I work with on a professional level, but I honestly mean even beyond that, seeing my parents, my friends, my family, my husband, seeing how my firm stance of this stuff and me talking about this stuff and doing this work impacts, seeps outward. My individual work has a community impact at some point, and even affects other people in our circle is pretty amazing. And then if we do this in inception layers, essentially, that where the people I do work with professionally as clients tell me that they're having that impact on the people around them also. And so you can see how doing individual work makes bigger change. That's definitely the thing that lights me up.
Oh my gosh. When I was making my notes for this question in this episode, the one thing I wrote down was seeing subtle changes in the people in my circle, shifting from this dieting lifestyle to a more relaxed relationship with eating and exercise, and how that snowballs out. So it is challenging and rewarding, because knowing what we know now about this anti-dieting lifestyle, I want people to get this and I want them to be successful, letting go of diet culture immediately. But then I have to always hold myself back and remember this is a big picture thing. This is something that takes time. This is something that takes a lifetime. But seeing these the subtle changes in people, I think is really, really cool, and something that needs to be acknowledged. And on a personal level, it's really freaking rewarding to not feel like I have to start back on another diet every Monday.
Totally. I could not.
Or to not spend time measuring food and tracking stuff in my fitness pal and that sort of thing. So there's a personal level and a community level and a professional level and a societal level. And I know y'all can't see me, but I'm doing hand signals of circles that are expanding.
It's concentric circles out, definitely. So that's all really heavy stuff. So let's end on a silly fun note, right?
Yeah.
Fun facts about Sadie. Tell me some.
So on the Enneagram, I forever thought that I was a 5 until I did a podcast interview with Empowered Enneagram, and it kind of came to light that I might not be a 5, but I think I kind of fall somewhere between a 5 or a 6, because every time I take the test, 5 and 6 are they're the same, almost. I get the same results on the pie chart of Enneagram numbers. So 5 or 6 in the Enneagram. And I know you mentioned you're a 9.
Yeah, but it's so interesting because for a really long time I thought I was a 2, but I retook the test basically, and it came up with a 9. And the more I learn about it, totally through Enneagram memes on Instagram. This is where I learn all things Enneagram. But the more I learn about it, the more I really, really heavily relate to the 9 and relate a lot less to the 2.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the test I took showed that I am evenly winged, essentially. So I basically have an even 1 wing and 8 wing. And I think that I definitely see how those wings show up for me in like balancing my nineness too. So we're like, I, for instance, don't, at least these days, struggle particularly. And you know what, I say these days, but I don't know that I ever really super struggled with expressing opinions. Like I've kind of always been a loudmouth, opinionated person. And I think part of that is environment, you know, like my dad used to get me to debate him on things when I was a kid. So like I definitely have cultivated an ability to express opinions, but I think a lot of that has to do with those wings also.
Yeah. So on the 4 tendencies, what is your tendency?
Oh, I am a questioner.
Oh!
Yeah. I am a questioner, and I am like I am definitely a questioner because I feel like my entire life is asking questions. My coaching style is all about asking questions and helping other people ask the right questions.
So let me ask you a question. If you had to guess what you think my tendency is on the 4 tendencies, what do you think it is?
I would guess that you were an upholder.
Upholder?
Are you?
Yeah.
Did I mention I'm also a psychic?
Yep. I am very much an upholder. Like, I take my responsibilities very seriously, and if you want to get something done, I will get it done.
I think you know that I very, very highly appreciate that tendency in you because I am not nearly as vivid. So,
yes. Awesome.
What sign are your birthday just passed, right?
Yeah.
So are you a Virgo?
Leo.
Okay,
Yep.
That was what I was going to say first. Okay.
Yep.
So,
what are you?
This is funny. I spent my entire life thinking I was an Aries. So, and I know it's like, how do you not know what your sun sign is? My birthday is the last day of Aries. So I was on the cusp, but I was like, it's the last day, I'm an Aries. A couple of years ago, I actually had like a chart done. And because of how late in the day I was born and like where I was born, I am actually a Taurus. And like, it's so funny. Again, totally basing all of this information on Instagram memes about astrology. I would say that a good 95% of the time, I much more heavily relate as a Taurus. There are some times where I like relate a little bit more as an Aries, but the vast majority of the time I'm like, oh yeah, Taurus was definitely right all along.
Yeah. Man, I love how we basically base our whole entire lives on Instagram memes.
We are going to wrap up each episode sort of reflecting on what's satisfying us right now. So Sadie, what's satisfying you this week?
I'm kind of nervous to say, just in fear that things might change due to COVID and stuff. But I am very satisfied in knowing that my kid is going to be starting, fingers crossed, and staying in preschool 5 days a week. And I'm excited to know that there are, like, I will have some intentional time to, like, sit down and work on stuff like this podcast and some other projects that are coming up later on in the year, so that it just feels satisfying knowing that there is a change coming, and I'm looking forward to that.
That's a good one, definitely.
Yeah. What about you?
Trash TV. I'm finding trash TV to be incredibly satisfying right now. So TV is totally my like go-to downtime self-care thing. Like, the busier I am, the more stuff I have on my plate, the more I turn to trash TV for like just recouping my energy, because I don't have to focus on it a lot. It's pure escapism. And I am currently binging Lucifer on Netflix. I guess another fun fact, I am like a huge Neil Gaiman fan, and I didn't realize this, but like the show, I guess, is actually based on the Lucifer comic books that were based on the character of Lucifer in the Sandman series. And so he didn't write it. Like, it's not a Neil Gaiman show, but like just that little bit of like connection was enough to make me be like, well, that's my new trash TV.
Yes. Do you have Discovery Plus?
No. Maybe? I don't know.
It is so good because all of my favorite trash TV is basically any kind of TLC reality show or any other reality show. And you know that show Naked and Afraid?
Yeah.
Well, there's a new spinoff of that on Discovery Plus, and it's Naked and Afraid Dating or something like that.
Oh my God, I saw an ad for that the other day. I was like, what?
It's good. And the crazy thing about Discovery Plus is on these new shows, they release one episode a week, so you can't just binge it. And it's good because it gives you something to look forward to, but at the same time, it's like, I just want to lay down and watch like 10 episodes in a row, but I can't. So there's pros and cons to it.
Love it. That's awesome. All right, Sadie. Well, I guess that's it for this week.
Yeah, I think that's all. And if you're listening to this podcast and you enjoyed it, we would love for you to continue supporting us by subscribing, rating, and reviewing to help us reach more people. And we recently started a new Instagram account just for this podcast. So come give us a follow at Satisfaction Factor Pod on Instagram.